All of you fellow Africans who are here, there is a sense in which we are mentally colonized. We either went to school in England, or in Lisbon, or in Paris, and even if we did not physically move, England came to us, Portugal came to us, Paris came to us. And you who are here, central bankers, will know that the central banks that you run are fundamentally mimicries of the central banks of the mother countries. But it's important to say that even as we talk about those erstwhile colonizers who never left, there was a new entrant into the arena, the United States of America. Not typically a colonizer, but became a hegemon after the World War II. And it's never lost on me is that in 1944, when most African countries had not regained their political independence, the United States of America and one of the worst colonizers that the world has ever known, Britain, sat in Bretton Woods in New Hampshire and gave birth to the IMF and the World Bank. They even mooted the idea of a trade organization which did not materialize, but today has manifested itself as the WTO. Ha-Joon Chang of Korea called them the unholy trinity. So when we are gathered here today, we must be conscious of those realities as African countries. We must be conscious of the fact that although the colonial project in its classical sense is no longer with us, in a very subtle and surreptitious and yet diabolical way, the neo-colonial process is still with us and still controls our institutions. I dare say, therefore, that the typical banking sectors of many African countries is Euro-American. Euro-American in the sense that the DNA of your central banks is borrowed from what happens in those erstwhile colonizers and what is dictated by the hegemon of the West, the United States of America. We may enact laws that regulate your central bank. You may enact regulations, but those regulations, as I've already said, and I repeat for effect, are poor mimicries. And in my respectful submission, that is why Africa never quite realizes her potential. We are a continent of 1.4 billion people. We have about 41 central banks and about 42 currencies, none of which is ever referred to as a hard currency. In South Africa, you have your rand. Sometimes it behaves well, sometimes it does not. In Zambia, they have their kwacha. In Kenya, our shilling. You have your kwanza or metikais or pula in Botswana. But these currencies are not currencies that can stand tall when push comes to shove. The almighty dollar is the holy grail that we all seek. When you don't have dollars, you think your country is spinning out of the orbit. If you doubt me, ask the Zimbabweans. And if you doubt me, visit any of the banks that you good ladies and gentlemen run, the rand will be kept outside, but when I want to withdraw dollars, you go to the inner recesses in a multiple locked cupboard to get the almighty dollar. So it dictates your economy. Intra-African trade, almost 80% is terminated in the dollar. The credit cards that we carry, whether you are from Nigeria or Kenya or Zambia, when you transact and as much as buy an item in a shop in Johannesburg, New York knows about it. London knows about it. That is the Africa that I'm talking about. It is an Africa that has continued to be manipulated from outside. That Africa has tried many times to disentangle herself from the chains and manacles of external control. But every time she tries, she fails. She is dictated to by IMF. Remember that in an effort to extricate ourselves from trying to do many things, but there is always the invisible foreign hand. In 1975, the Lomé Convention, signed in Lomé in Togo, putting together African countries and Caribbeans and Pacific. We promised ourselves under Lomé that we would interact, but we would regain our independence. It never came to pass. In 2000, we had the Cotonou Agreement. We are never shy of signing agreements. And then in 1980, we now say we don't want to cohabit with these countries, we want to go it alone. The Lagos Plan of Action of 1980 was our blueprint in that regard. I'm here to report to you that the Lagos Plan of Action failed spectacularly. Africa is a forest of agreements, charters, and protocols which are honored in breach. And for that reason, you always have the external hand. In 1980s, the IMF was here in Africa, bestriding the continent like the fabled Colossus. One size fits all solutions. The IMF came with structural adjustment programs. You'll remember them. And you banks were the midwives of those processes. The structural adjustment programs failed spectacularly. And even as I speak to you now, the wounds that it inflicted are with us as I speak. You central bankers will remember in 1980s when you are being told to devalue your currencies against the dollar, to devalue your currencies against the British sterling pound, to devalue your currency against the franc as it then was. And of course, we did. Not forgetting that at that time, the United States dollar had become a fiat currency and supported completely by gold during the Nixonian period. But still, we worshipped the dollar. I remember as a young boy, in 1975, I was very young but curious. And I always remember Henry Kissinger at that time and Sheikh Yamani of the Saudis when the petrodollar entered into the arena, and the world has never been the same again. Africans were there. But it's in the 60s that the Africa that I'm talking about came to the fore in a much more powerful way, with the independence of Ghana in 1957 on the 6th day of March. And as I look at the leaders of that day, when they looked at Africa, and Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana was the most passionate, most eloquent, most far-seeing in this regard. Kwame said, "Seek ye first the political kingdom, and the rest shall be given unto you." We sought and obtained the political kingdom, and I even doubt whether we have it, and the rest has never come. In 1963, on the 25th day of May to be exact, 32 heads of states and government gathered in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And I urge you to read the speech delivered by Kwame Nkrumah, exhorting the leaders of the day. Let us not leave here without a single central bank, he said. Let us not leave here without a single currency. Let us not leave here without a single policy on matters finance. Because if we don't, the independence that we are talking about will mean nothing. We'll have received the crown without the jewel. And indeed, we received the crown that we call political independence without the jewel that is economic independence. And the Africa that you have asked me to talk about is that Africa without jewels, a continent with 1.4 billion people with a GDP which is smaller than that of the Federal Republic of Germany. The state of California in the United States of America has a GDP larger than the entire continent of Africa. That is the continent that we are talking about. But yet somehow throughout the ages, this Africa remains attractive to the West. It remains attractive to the rest of the world. In the last 4 months, it has not been lost on me. I've noticed something that is reminiscent of the scramble for Africa. It is a new scramble for Africa. The Secretary of State of the United States of America was here. Immediately after the Russian Foreign Secretary was here. The Chinese was here. The French president was here. The Turkish president was here. The Qataris were here. As I speak now, the Italian president is in my country, Kenya, as I speak. The American vice president will be coming here. And it doesn't stop at that. Every year, African heads of state, and some of you accompany them, are summoned, not invited. Never use the word invited. On the 15th day of December, they were summoned to Washington, D.C., 49 of them. Then they will be summoned to Beijing. Then they'll be summoned to London. Before the Ukraine war, they would be summoned to Sochi in Russia. Then they are summoned to Little Qatar. Then they are summoned to New Delhi. That is the Africa that we are talking about, whose central banks you manage. Mickey Mice. Mickey Mice central banks. Aramco announced her profits yesterday, $161 billion. That is bigger than the economy of Mozambique, Angola, Eswatini, Lesotho, Zambia, and Malawi combined. Shell announced their profit this year, $160 billion, bigger than the economy of Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania combined, one company. And then you come and say, I'm a central bank governor of what? So let us, as we talk about central banking, saying, let us be measured in our language. We are not comparing. How glad I am to be present with you this afternoon, and to say in advance that contrary to the promise that has been made, I'm not going to focus on corruption. I'm going to make mention of it. But I'm going to pose the question, whither Africa? And I say so acutely aware that those of you who are here are central bankers and bankers who are active in the continent of Africa. The continent of Africa, as we all know, is a continent that has been abused and cannibalized over the years. She's a continent that many times is mentioned as if she were homogeneous, which is not true. Many of you will know, courtesy of history, that this continent is divided into 54 odd countries, the product of one of the most diabolical schemes ever visited by man to man, the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, where the now pontificating countries of the West sat and carved out spheres of influence. And when we talk about Africa today, we are talking about post-colonial Africa. We never talk about Africa before colonization. And in fact, even after the process of decolonization had been undertaken and it went through its course, the Africa that we continue to talk about is still defined by the erstwhile colonizers in derogatory terms. You still hear the erstwhile colonizers in their unguarded moments refer to Africa as Anglophone Africa, as Lusophone Africa, as Francophone Africa. And as if to add insult to injury, for reasons that I have never understood, they succeeded in persuading Africans to be members of post-colonial organizations such as the Commonwealth. And it is never lost on me that the Commonwealth, which is an organization supposedly of equal countries, has as its titular and permanent head the British monarch. And in the recent past, they have been attracting countries which were not formerly their colonies, like Rwanda and Mozambique. The French also have their own, and the French were always more pernicious and remain pernicious today. They put together their former colonies and still control their banks, complete with a currency that is printed and controlled from Paris, the CFA franc. The Portuguese were a little weaker, and therefore they have their own organization. But there is a sense in which if you are from Angola or from Mozambique or from Cabo Verde, or Guinea-Bissau, you still look to Lisbon as your true north. That is the Africa that I'm talking about. It is an Africa which has inherited institutions which she does not understand.